on man and the environment. From Brazil, where man threatens man in the rush for modern wealth, to Britain, where a priceless collection falls victim to capricious nature, and to Australia, where a huge river is slowly dying. Some of the reports on Earthfile. First to South Africa, where scientists rebuild a long-dead animal.
When the early settlers pushed inland from Cape Town, capital of the Cape Colony, they encountered, to their delight, vast numbers of zebra. Great herds of one particular zebra subspecies, the quagga, roamed freely across the Great Karoo Plains of South Africa, from Bushmanland in the west to the Orange Free State in the east. But the quagga, now regarded as a close relative of these southern plains zebra, was doomed. Ruthlessly slaughtered by the new settlers for meat for their Hottentot workers, the ill-fated quagga never had a chance. By the year 1883, it had become extinct, a museum piece, yet another reminder of man's lack of foresight. This mare died at the London Zoo in 1872. Ironically, the hunting of the ill-fated quagga and other threatened animals was finally outlawed, just 3 years after the very last quagga died at a zoo in Amsterdam. But this man, Reinhold Rau, the chief taxidermist at the South African Museum, is convinced that the quagga can be virtually reincarnated, not by divine intervention, but through a breeding program involving stock carefully selected from the quagga's cousins, the southern plains zebra.
And since this is now confirmed, there is, of course, good reason to believe that quagga genes are still alive in the present southernmost populations of the plains zebra.
While reconstructing the remains of this quagga foal, the taxidermist noted the similarity of its color and stripings to the markings of related living zebra.
The stripe and the interspace is usually roughly the same width. In the quagga, the interspace, or the light stripe if you want to, is usually narrower than the actual stripe. Now we select for these three characteristics: narrow interspaces, dark basic color, and reduced striping.
As a result of Mr. Rau's findings, an ambitious rebreeding program has been launched here by the Cape Department of Nature and Environmental Conservation. Dr. Jeff McLaughlin has carefully supervised the capture of 8 plains zebra from the Etosha Game Reserve in Namibia. But the program has been extremely controversial.
Several people had suggested trying to breed plain zebra without as much striping as they normally have. But a lot of people objected to this because they said, well, they didn't know what the quagga was originally. They thought it was perhaps a totally separate species, and therefore there was no point in making a thing. All you would get is a look-alike that you could say looked like a quagga, but it had no real relationship to the extinct animal.
But the question of relationship was resolved by a Californian biochemist, Dr. Russell Higuchi. He believed he could extract from a fragment of the quagga the most fundamental genetic fingerprint of all, DNA. Deoxyribonucleic acid. The complex instructions from which all the different proteins which made up the living quagga were initially created. But even if he could extract the DNA, could it be cloned for further essential research? Dr. Higuchi identified a solvent to strip out any DNA, then introduced a virus to link it up and added bacteria, with which the virus now carrying any quagga DNA would react. Culture plates like this one revealed minute quantities of DNA were present, perhaps only about 1/1,000,000th of the total picture when the quagga was alive, but enough to be cloned and enough to reveal a strong similarity with today's zebras. In this case, a dot in the lower column indicates a match with a zebra. The comparatively few letters show where the DNA of today's zebra does not correspond with that of its extinct close relative. Dr. Higuchi had succeeded in extracting tiny but extremely valuable fragments of the chemical foundation of a life form that ceased to exist a century ago.
The kind of information we want could still be found in these very small fragments. And within those fragments, the sequence preservation was very good and accurate to the point where we don't think there is very much change at all, even though it's been dead for 100 years.
The scientists' findings ended the arguments about the relationship of the quagga to other zebra. Clearly, it was the southernmost representative of the plain zebra, a subspecies which had lost its striping simply because it didn't need it.
So now the whole experiment made sense. It was worth doing because if we produced something, it would be genetically related to the plain zebra and therefore a genuine quagga, not just some sort of look-alike which you might have got by crossing a donkey with a zebra, something like that. But that would have been a meaningless exercise.
With luck, the breeders say they could produce a quagga within 3 years. But more than likely, the program will take at least a decade. However long it takes, Dr. McLaughlin and his team are convinced the work must continue. They're determined to reintroduce an animal needlessly and shamefully exterminated by man.
From South Africa to South America, where native people face an uncertain future.
The Balbina Dam in remote northern Amazonia is one of the biggest hydroelectric projects ever undertaken in Brazil. Situated in the heart of virgin rainforest, it's also one of the most controversial. 7,500 workers are labouring to drown an area the size of Luxembourg. The electricity will be used to power the commercial city of Manaus, 150 kilometres south. This is a frontier town, boasting 10% growth a year and a constant influx of new industry. The cost of the city's success is the transformation of the Watiman River from a teeming life force to a stagnant lake, punctuated by dying trees. The advance of the water also means that 400 Amazonian Indians must be moved from their tribal homeland, where they've lived for countless generations. The Waiamuri Atroari, who live in 5 small villages, are semi-nomadic hunters who move occasionally from one part of the jungle to another. Their way of life hasn't changed for hundreds of years, although the influence of the newer Brazilians shows in their clothing, metal cooking implements and tools. They're just one of the many thousands of tribes of the Amazon, isolated even from each other by the encircling forest. And like the forest, they too are threatened. When the Portuguese first arrived in Brazil 500 years ago, there were probably 2 million Indians in the Amazon. Now it's estimated there are a quarter of that number. Always there's a government official to explain why they must move or accept a new restriction on their freedom. Thomas, the head man, can only agree to do what they're asked. The alternative in this instance is to drown. Their new village is being built in a clearing 1 hour's drive to the north. The shell of the most important structure, the men's house, is already well advanced. They do the work themselves, transported to and from the site by workers from the dam project. They must move quickly. Time is running out for their old home and the forest they know so well around it. It's also running out for their river, a small branch of the Watiman they know as the Taquari. It too will be flooded by the dam, and future songs must regard it only as legend. But it's not just the Indians who are being moved. This is the former home of a rubber tapper. This is where he now lives. In common with many other tappers, Antonia lived next door to the Indians in the forest, using shared paths to cut trees and collect the sap for the meagre return it brings. For him, it's better than living in one of Brazil's overcrowded and poverty-stricken cities. But at an age when most men want to take things easy, Antonio will have to start again. Below the dam, settlers face an entirely different problem, a shortage of water because the river has been cut. In places, all that remains is mud. Peasant farmers who've settled the Amazon fear it could spell the end of their tenuous hold on the land. Without the river, nothing will grow. Here, the dam builders have provided a pump, but it's small and inefficient and is already drawing dam water poisoned by rotting vegetation. At least one positive initiative has emerged from the Balbina project. Brazil's archaeologists were called in to the forest to undertake the first systematic study of Indian remains. What they discovered hidden in the litter of the forest floor surprised even them. Here they found the prolific remains of tribes which had totally disappeared. The area had once been densely populated. Relics have been dated back 2,000 years. The archaeologists also found an amulet in the shape of a symbol local Indians call the Murakitan. Their legend says it's the sign used by female warriors, the Amazons of popular myth. The name was also given to the ecological and cultural rescue project launched by the dam builders. If the legend is half true, the waters of the Balbina Dam could be drowning any evidence that the Amazons ever existed. It's certainly drowning some of the most important sites of Indian archaeology. The collected relics are taken to a local museum where they're cleaned and numbered. It's a painstaking task, but it's hoped it will provide insights into a people whose history and way of life may vanish. And this is the Murakitan. It's a symbol which helps to focus much-needed public attention on the Indians. But it's unlikely to be enough to prevent a tradition and culture disappearing from view forever. Conservationists question whether the benefits of the Balbina Dam project are worth the destruction it's caused. As Brazil flounders under massive foreign debts, many argue that they are. But it's another nail in the coffin of the greatest rainforest on Earth, one which provides most of the Earth's oxygen and where a dwindling race barely survives.
To the United States, where harmless pleasure causes deadly poisoning.
Whatever the size or speed of their craft, lots of people enjoy boating as a recreation. What could be more harmless? And yet, more and more boat owners are using anti-fouling paints containing a deadly chemical, tributyl tin, known as TBT. The paints are designed to keep boats' hulls free of barnacles and weed. Dr. Bob Huggett of the Virginia Institute of Marine Science is worried.
I personally believe, as do many of my colleagues around this country and in Europe, that tributyl tin is the most toxic compound that we're intentionally adding to our waters that we know about.
TBT-based paints are intended to kill some marine life. They are undoubtedly very good at ridding boat hulls of the algae, barnacles and weeds that can reduce cruising speed and fuel efficiency. Normally, yachts need to be scraped down once a year. With TBT-based paint, that can be cut to every 3 or even 5 years. Unfortunately, research shows TBT's lethal power is not reserved for its official targets. It kills or harms fish and shellfish, as well as plankton, a basic element in the marine food chain. Fish and plant life have already completely disappeared from some marinas, and elsewhere scientists have observed strange deformations and upsets in the reproductive systems of fish. Many rare and beautiful species are threatened. Dr. Huggett monitors TBT levels in harbour waters and mud. In France, TBT has been tightly controlled since it was found to be devastating oyster beds. Britain has banned paints containing tributyl tin. Campaigners there pointed to tests by the US Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, which showed that TBT has the same sort of effect on the immune systems of rats and mice as AIDS. Although TBT has been around for years, it's only recently that tests have been developed to measure it accurately. It's thought to be safe at around 20 parts per trillion. One marina in San Diego, California, recently recorded a level 500 times that.
Back and let the layers separate.
If marine life suffers, so will humans, as Senator Paul Tribble points out.
If we kill fish and clams and oysters, we're going to have a tremendous impact on our economy, a loss of jobs, and we may very well imperil people's lives. So it's that weighing and balancing that must take place. People really don't understand that the widespread use of TBT paints is a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. And the impact on our lives, on the economy of our waterways, could be disastrous.
The EPA is still studying TBT and is due to rule on it in 1988. Manufacturer Arthur Sheldon of M&T Chemicals believes it's safe.
Tributyl compounds over the past 25 years have been tested extensively to determine the safety of these materials in use. And we have determined that they are, in fact, safe in use to man and his environment.
Though he admits it can cause skin irritation if people apply the paint without special equipment. At present, the US Navy uses a less toxic copper-based anti-fouling paint, but it has begun testing TBT compound on some of its fleet in the hope that the EPA will give a green light for general use. The Navy say TBT would make their ships faster and shorten emergency response time.
It's terribly important that any naval vessel be able to go at full speed, particularly aircraft carriers who must achieve certain speeds to dispatch and receive aircraft.
Potential savings to the Navy are estimated at $100 million a year, with less need for dry docking and maintenance work. But if the vast hulls of naval vessels were coated with TBT, the amount in use would be tripled at a swoop. At present, yachts and recreational boats are responsible for most of the TBT found in United States waters. Probably very few yachtsmen know that their gleaming hulls are killing marine life. But unless they're prepared to keep scraping at those barnacles, experts predict catastrophe for fish, shellfish, and inevitably humans too.
From the US to the UK, where keepers of a unique collection struggle to preserve it.
The Great Storm of 1987 was the worst hurricane to hit Britain for 300 years. Its effects were devastating. "18 people were killed, hundreds of homes were destroyed, and up to 20 million trees were uprooted. At Kew Gardens, to the west of London, staff woke up to a nightmare. One of the best plant collections in the world had been ripped apart. 1,000 trees lay fallen or were fatally damaged, among them some of the oldest and rarest specimens. Months later, clearing up continues, and many trees still lie uprooted. The curator at Kew, John Simmons, says the storm's effect was unparalleled.
When a storm comes, I expect to lose 3 or 4 trees, and in a sense it's a test of your tree surgery, because it's usually the weak trees that go. But to see perfectly healthy trees like this lying behind us, nothing wrong with it, down like 9 pins all around you, I couldn't believe it. I suppose you can only think of it in human terms. It's that scale, isn't it? You've talked about here of about 1,000 trees, which is sort of 2 jumbo loads of people going down, and on a national scale, you know, two times the population of London going in a night. It's that sudden, in our lifetime, trees that would have gone beyond us and been there for our children to enjoy have gone overnight. It's that tragedy.
The tree clearing units faced a mammoth task with many hundreds of tons of dying wood to cut up and take away. Some trees, like this one, rest precariously and dangerously in the branches of others. The root system is irreparably damaged, and sadly it has to come down. The wood won't go to waste. Craftsmen and furniture makers swamped Kew with requests for some of the rarest raw material they were ever likely to find. Other tree fragments were given to members of the public. In return, some made donations to the Clearing Up Fund. Kew also kept some material for research and some to initiate a remarkable rescue program. In this warm and humid glasshouse, next to plants who prefer a more tropical climate, a new generation of the trees is being spawned. The smallest twigs cut from the greatest oaks can be made to grow here into new saplings, bearing the exact characteristics of the original plant. At least 40 of the lost trees are being regrown in this way. In 100 years, these twigs may grow up to be the latest attractions at Kew. In this laboratory, tree surgery steps firmly into the 21st century. Under conditions as sterile as any operating theatre, Kew scientists regrow the rarest and most difficult tree specimens using a process called micropagination. The tiniest buds are taken, some smaller than a millimetre, and are then placed onto a growing medium. One day they too will become entire trees to replace the original plant. Unit Supervisor Mike Fay says the process has proved invaluable.
We've managed now to put in about a dozen trees that were blown down in the hurricane, which are irreplaceable by collecting more from the wild, or which are special forms. And the ones that are difficult to propagate by conventional means, then we've now put those into culture. So about a dozen trees, hopefully in the end, will be a dozen different types of tree will be back into the collections at Kew through this process.
One such rescue success is a variety of Chinese maple, brought to Kew in the 1920s by British plant collector Joseph Hurst. It's already showing 2 healthy fledgling leaves. When it's much older, the maple and the other rescued trees at Kew will be planted again in the sandy soil which is their home. In the world of tree husbandry, there's no shortcut to restore a battered national collection, one which is a reference book for the world. But at Kew, the scientists have learned how to give the trees a helping hand.
And finally to Australia, where a river is working overtime for man and industry.
Water, a precious commodity here in Australia, the driest continent on Earth, where even the smallest of streams transform the harshest of hot lands, creating lush, cool oases teeming with wildlife. This has often been called the lucky country. Here in the heart of the Murray-Darling River system, the world's 4th largest, it's easy to see just how Australia earned the title. The principal river, the Murray, is 2,600 kilometres long. Riverboats have long served the communities which grew rapidly as farmers settled along the fertile banks of the river system. For more than a century, farmers have been pumping water from the rivers to irrigate land once regarded as desert. Today, the Murray-Darling Basin is a massive food bowl. Its grapes are in constant demand for wine production. And sweet, juicy riverland citrus ends up on tables in many countries. Dams were first constructed on the Murray in the 1880s. Those early construction projects hardly compare with the massive dams and weirs which today control the waters of the river system, waters now used to generate hydroelectricity and irrigate land, producing 46% of Australia's agricultural produce. It's easy to see why Australians have become so dependent on this wondrous waterway, but that dependency could mean disaster. Irrigation, which brought life to the desert, now threatens to destroy a pastoral paradise. Water dripping from a spring on the Murray's banks has a salt level of 100,000 parts per million. That's about 3 times saltier than the sea. It's salt pushed up by irrigation water that's destroying agricultural land here. Beneath the topsoil lies a layer of sand and salt. It's 30 meters deep. Excessive irrigation causes water to percolate down into it. This raises the water table. Salt is forced to the surface. The land is permanently soured. And damming the rivers has caused other problems, each of them an environmental disaster. Here, a great forest has literally drowned, the tragic victim of river control. Elsewhere, trees are being killed by localized unseasonal droughts, again the result of river control. The Barmah forest, Australia's largest, used to flood in winter and spring. Now it's dry at these times, but floods in summer as water is held back for the irrigation. In a bid to save the forest, its greatest assets have to be felled. It's the greatest trees of the forest, the giants which once gave it life, that now threaten its existence. In the summer months, it seems they're just too thirsty. To ensure that younger trees don't die, conservation control has been introduced. This grand old man of the forest has to be felled. Its great thirst has condemned it. Pollution levels are also extremely high in the Murray River. Salt washes into it. Insecticides, pesticides and fertilizers used by farmers wash into it. And industry dumps waste in the river. Governments, the federal government and 3 state governments are involved to impose controls. This paper mill, for instance, uses 18 megalitres of river water a day and returns 15 megalitres, all of it filtered. But there's a lot of concern about effluent tanks built too close to the river banks by towns along the Murray. They're partly blamed for viruses found in river water. It might be difficult to understand how the river could even be considered as a source of drinking water. But in such a dry country, there is little choice. As astounding as it might seem, filtered and heavily chlorinated water from the Murray is virtually the only source of drinking water for a number of communities. These include Adelaide, a city of 1 million people. Little wonder, then, that the water here, which falls below standards acceptable to the World Health Organization, is a major political issue. But Adelaide isn't the only centre involved. The Darling and Murray rivers and their tributaries run through 3 states. All of the state governments involved and the federal government appear concerned about the potential of losing vast tracts of agricultural land. But despite all this apparent concern, the experts say nothing is really being done. They accuse the governments of bickering instead of acting. In the meantime, Australia's riverland is dying.
World, and they belong to the extinct blue antelope, and they were discovered recently by scientists at the South African Museum in Cape Town.
This is an artist's impression of the blue antelope, which became extinct around 1800, 70 years before the much publicized disappearance of the quagga. South Africa only had illustrations and fossil records of the extinct antelope until today's discovery. It is only a pair of horns, but it has created great excitement in the scientific community.
Well, it's probably the only set of horns, it's certainly the only set known in southern Africa. There may be 3 or 4 in Europe, but they're associated with mounted specimens and have never been examined carefully. So, in effect, this is a very unique kind of record. We have it in fossil form, but this is the first time we've actually had something that was taken from a living animal by somebody who presumably saw it.
Professor Eric Harley, a UCT geneticist, immediately set to work removing small pieces of tissue from the horn, for it holds the genetic clues which scientists are seeking.
Even those minute quantities may be quite enough, using some very interesting new techniques, particularly a technique called a polymerase chain reaction, which amplifies up even the most minutest quantities of DNA in such specimens.